At El Alamein, years after the war, British and German veterans began meeting in the desert where they had once fought. Old enemies shaking hands over the graves, remembering North Africa as a clean fight between professionals. They call it a war without hate. The army those Germans had served was Hitler's, and the Afrika Korps itself had been destroyed in 1943. What survived the defeat was not the army, but its reputation, and the men who lost the war were the ones who decided how it would be remembered. For decades, much of the world believed them. The last message left the Afrika Korps on May 12, 1943. Pinned against the sea in northern Tunisia, out of fuel and almost out of ammunition, its final commander, General Hans Kramer, sent a short signal to Berlin. The ammunition was spent, he reported, the weapons destroyed. The Corps had fought to the end. He ended with a defiant promise the Afrika Korps would rise again. Then his men smashed the radios. 6 months earlier, the Corps had been a very different thing. Rommel's desert army had driven the British back across Libya and into Egypt, stopping within 70 miles of Alexandria. The defeat at El Alamein in November 1942 ended that. What followed was a fighting retreat of more than 1,000 miles west across Libya and into Tunisia, where Hitler poured in fresh divisions only to seal their fate. By May 1943, there was nowhere left to go. Rommel himself was already gone. Worn down and ill, he had left Africa in March, 2 months before the end, and the army that carried his name surrendered without him. The surrender was enormous. Across Tunisia, roughly 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, around 130,000 of them German. More Germans went into captivity in those few days than had surrendered at Stalingrad 3 months before. Some called it Tunisgrad. The entire command structure was swept up. Generals, staff officers, technicians, mechanics, because Hitler had refused to evacuate them until it was too late. Kramer himself was flown to Britain and held at Trent Park, a country house outside London, reserved for captured German generals. He didn't spend the rest of the war behind the wire. In May 1944, sick and failing, he was sent home early in a prisoner exchange, arranged through the Swedish Red Cross. He was one of the very few who left that way. For almost everyone else, captivity was only the beginning. The fighting in the desert was over, but the men who had waged it were about to be scattered across the world, and most of them would not set foot in Germany again for years. The ship sailed west. Feeding and guarding 250,000 prisoners in North Africa was more than the Allies wanted to manage, and the transports that had carried troops and supplies east were sailing back to America empty. The prisoners filled those empty ships. Through the summer of 1943, tens of thousands of Afrika Korps men crossed the Atlantic, not as conquerors but as captives. They were held in hundreds of camps, from Camp Shelby in Mississippi to Camp Hearn in Texas, while others stayed in British hands closer to home. They worked the land under guard and ate better than the families they had left behind. What set these men apart was timing. Because they had been captured in 1943, the desert veterans were among the first large group of Germans to go into Allied captivity and among the last to come out. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Many Afrika Korps prisoners were not sent home until 1947 or 1948, after years of labor. Some were handed to Britain and France for reconstruction work before they ever saw German soil again. The war that had ended for everyone else dragged on for them behind the wire. Not every desert veteran went west. Hans von Luck had served under Rommel since training as a young cadet under him in 1931, and he commanded a reconnaissance battalion in the desert through the retreat from El Alamein. But von Luck was pulled back to Europe before Tunisia fell. He fought through Normandy, then was thrown into the final battles in the east, and in 1945 he surrendered not to the Americans or the British, but to the Soviets. That difference decided the next 5 years of his life. Von Luck was sent to a labor camp in the Caucasus, where German prisoners mined coal and rebuilt what their army had destroyed. He was not released until 1950, long after the men who had been captured beside him in the desert were already home. When he finally returned, he found work as a hotel receptionist and later moved into the coffee trade. The officer who had once led Rommel's reconnaissance in the desert started over as a clerk. The men who came back found a divided, occupied country ashamed of itself. Their old army was disbanded and disgraced, but the desert veterans had one thing the others did not. Their war had been fought far from the Eastern Front and far from the camps that came to define the regime, and that distance left them the room to tell a different story. They could not rebuild the army they had lost, but they could rebuild the story of it. Siegfried Westphal had begun rebuilding the army's reputation before he was even free. As Rommel's chief of staff in the desert, he had survived the war, surrendered to the Americans, and then appeared as a witness at the Nuremberg trials, where he argued that the German army had fought an ordinary soldiers' war, separate from the crimes of the regime. Released in 1947, he turned that argument into an organization. Faijdherbe became the head of the Veterans Association of the Afrika Korps, and in 1955, he helped fold Germany's old soldiers into a Europe-wide league of former servicemen. He was a careful, methodical man, and he gave the desert veterans something to belong to. The association needed a figurehead, and the choice it made revealed exactly what these men believed. In 1952, it gave its honorary presidency to Albert Kesselring, the field marshal who had commanded German forces in Italy. A British court had convicted him of war crimes for ordering the deaths of hundreds of Italian civilians. His sentence had been commuted, and he had been released early on grounds of ill health. To much of Europe, he was a convicted war criminal. To the men of the Desert War, he was a respected old commander, and they put him at their head. The reunions grew, and the most striking guests were British. Former officers of the 8th Army began attending Afrika Korps gatherings, shaking hands with the men they had fought. In 1956, after senior British officers appeared at one such reunion, a member of Parliament demanded to know why serving soldiers were fraternizing with a group led by a convicted war criminal. The War Minister defended it. Boycotting the reunions, he said, would not serve good relations between Britain and Germany. The Desert War was becoming something both sides wanted to celebrate together. For the British veterans, the myth had its own value. It turned their own desert campaign into something cleaner and grander than the rest of the war, a contest of professionals against an enemy worth respecting. For some of the men, the reconciliation was entirely sincere. Hans von Luck, home from his years in Soviet captivity, spent his later life building friendships with the British and American officers he had once tried to destroy. Among them was John Howard, the British commander who had seized Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. Von Luck lectured on the war, took old enemies back over the ground they had fought on, and spoke of forgiveness rather than grievance. He meant it. What was taking shape across these gatherings was bigger than any of the men involved. The veterans had lost the war, but year by year, gathering by gathering, they were deciding what the Desert War had been, and the story they told was about to spread far beyond the men who had lived it. In 1951, only 6 years after the war, Hollywood released a film with a German general as its hero. The Desert Fox told the story of Erwin Rommel to audiences in the very countries he had fought, and they admired him. Rommel had taken his own life in 1944 on Hitler's orders, and that death turned him into something rare among German commanders, a soldier the Allies could mourn. His reputation pulled the whole Afrika Korps up with him. The phrase came from Rommel's own papers, "A war without hate." After 1945, those words became the accepted truth about North Africa, the one clean campaign of the war, fought by professionals in an empty desert. The timing helped. As the Cold War deepened and West Germany rearmed for NATO, a German soldier who had fought honorably made the new army easier to accept. Memoirs by men like Faijdherbe poured out, all telling the same story. For decades, the story held, but the desert had never been as empty or as clean as the legend claimed. As the Afrika Korps moved through Libya, it took part in the machinery of persecution. German forces began the deportation of the Jews from Cyrenaica, and around 2,600 were sent to a camp in Giardo, in the desert south of Tripoli, where they were held under forced labor and hundreds died. Some were carried there in the same trucks that supplied Rommel's army. In occupied Tunisia, thousands of Jewish men were forced into labor gangs under German command. The Clean Desert War was a story about its soldiers, and it left everyone else out of the frame. None of this erased what was real. The handshakes at El Alamein had happened, the friendships were genuine, and von Luck's reconciliation was sincere, but the story those reunions produced was not the same thing as the truth. This was the strange afterlife of the Afrika Korps. The Corps had ended in Tunisia with a single message in Morse code. Its men had spent years in captivity, come home to a ruined country, and watched their old army dissolve into disgrace. And out of it all they salvaged one last victory. It was not a battlefield, a city, or a campaign. It was a reputation. The men who lost the Desert War were the ones who decided how it would be remembered, and for 50 years, the losers wrote it. Well, that's it. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Rommel's Family After World War II next. And if you want more forgotten aftermath stories from the Second World War, subscribe to History Inside. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.